Okay, the recording started, and so we'll begin the session. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to another Brightspace training session. This morning, we're going to be doing a training set called ADAPT, which targets really those of you dealing with subject sites that have been migrated from Blackboard, from our existing LMS into the new environment in Brightspace, and having a look at that system in terms of building familiarity, for example, and working with that content coming from Blackboard. My name is Lachlan Callish. For those of you that I haven't met before, I'm the Learning Innovation Lead in the Division of Learning Tech. Learning and Teaching, I should say, not Learning Tech. All right, before I begin the training session, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country, and I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra and Biripi peoples of Australia, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which Charles Sturt's campuses are located. Pay my respect to their elders, both past, present and emerging. And we are coming to you from a beautiful blue sky above Wiradjuri land today. Let's hope that continues. All right. In terms of the training continuum that we have for Brightspace, the ADAPT session sits here in the middle. Basically, if I start sharing my screen, that might help. And what we're getting at there, is that sharing yet? It is not. Let's try again. Can everyone see my desktop at that point? Yep,
yeah, it
great.
is sharing, Lachlan.
Oh, okay, great. I'm slightly losing track of where it is in Zoom. That's great. All right, so the two sessions that we run in the middle here deal with either brand new Brightspace sites or sandboxes, for example, org sites, building from scratch, or in the case of ADAPT, the specific scenario is that you've had content, subject site within Blackboard that has been migrated by the project team, the LMS project team, into Brightspace and then optimized. And we will break down what that term actually refers to and what happens within that process as a part of this session. I will say that if you've got any questions, etc., please put them into the chat, and either myself or my lovely co-host, Amy Martin, from the LMS training team, will pick up on those comments, and I will be stopping pretty frequently in here to make sure that we're not missing any of those, and also that I'm not losing my breath, getting a drink, etc. The work that happens within the Brightspace subject sites is underpinned by the LMS design principles, which are the Senate-endorsed overarching principles that inform how we build content and how our instructors, etc., approach their own building processes within the LMS. And so you have 5 fairly broad principles here, but what I'll also provide within the chat is the link which actually takes you to a breakdown of those individual standards and gives you a little bit more information. So you might be saying, well, all of my subject sites are welcoming. What are they specifically getting at in that case? And if you were to open that link, it'll take you to a page within the DLT website that actually provides a bit more information around what those particular standards look like. So these are to help inform how you approach the building process within your own subject sites. So that is on slide 3, and I will share the training deck again into the chat for those of you that didn't get it earlier. What we're trying to achieve today is to help you feel like you can effectively navigate within Brightspace, particularly with a focus around proofing your content within migrated master subject sites. We'll talk about that term in a minute. We're also hoping that you develop an evolving understanding of the migration process, the project team that handles that, as well as any additional work that needs to happen beyond that migration. And we're going to spend the last sort of the second half of the training session looking at assessment in particular within the master site. And we'll be using this term assessment shells quite a lot, talking about preparing the first part of assessment before your teaching sites, your session subject sites, are provisioned 4 weeks prior to the beginning of each session. So what we do within the master is we prepare a pristine version of the assessment, so to speak, without specific information such as dates and weighting. And we have that ready so that once we get into our session subject sites, we can actually join that information up with the gradebook columns that are created at that point in time. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. We talk a lot more about that process within the Engage assessment session. Today, we're going to be looking at the content creation aspect. All right, let's get into it with a little bit of context to help you feel a bit more comfortable within Brightspace. I am going to spend most of my time within the LMS itself, not looking at the slide deck itself on your screens, but I'll let you know which sort of slides I'm using as I go through as well. You're going to be hearing a bunch of new terminology throughout the session if you haven't been in one of these before. We've collected some of those on slide 8 in the deck. But just to help with that kind of context building aspect of the session, we start getting into Brightspace using our Charles Sturt single sign-on credentials. That happens from the base address of learn.csu.edu.au, and that will bring you into a login page which requires your CSU login credentials. Once you've logged in, that will bring you into a Brightspace homepage, also referred to as your personal homepage, and that looks a lot like this. I'll move this off the screen now so I can keep jumping around within the system here. From your Brightspace homepage, you'll see a number of subject site thumbnails if you have access to multiple subject sites, organized within these white boxes, which are referred to as widgets or tools. And quite often you'll find that you have the ability to then go further within those tools by hitting drop downs next to each of the labels on those boxes. You'll hear reference to the subject nav, which is the black menu area above your entry screen. Your nav will actually change between entering Brightspace, so the Brightspace homepage and your subject homepages. So you'll see different options appearing in the nav. Another way of getting access to your subjects is also via what's referred to as the waffle or the course selector, which is this collection of square boxes up here. When you click on that, it will also allow you to pin particular subjects, favorites, etc., to the top of this menu, so you don't have to go hunting for them, but you can also search and any subject that you have access to, whether it's a master subject, a session subject site, or an org site, a sandbox, all of them you can find through this search tool at the top. Pin them if you're so inclined. But you'll find with the pinning that the most recent object that you pin will appear at the bottom of this list. So if you're ever trying to reorder them, it's probably easiest just to unpin them all and then start again, knowing that the one that you've pinned most recently will appear at the bottom. Okay, so we've mentioned widgets. We talked a little bit about the Brightspace homepage. When we enter our individual subjects, whether it's a master site, which is generally distinguished by an M dash at the beginning of the subject code. When we enter into those sites, as I mentioned, you'll find that the navigation bar, the nav, changes again with more options specific to the subject. And within that menu, you'll find a number of nested menus, so with drop downs next to them that give you access to other tools and options. Most of today's session we're looking at either content or assessment, and we'll be going into some of the tools available in there as well. When students actually view Brightspace subject sites, the view is quite different, and the best way for you to get an idea of what that view looks like is to actually click on your profile up in the top right-hand corner, which will actually tell you what role you're logged in as currently, and then you can change that to a learner view if you're inclined to do that. You won't see all the options that I've got here, but you'll certainly see learner and your normal instructor role for most teachers in this space. Once you're in here as a student, you'll see a lot of similarity, but particularly if you're getting into content, and there are multiple ways of getting into the content. either through the My Topics widget, which will allow you to see this thumbnail view of your content areas, your content folders, if you will. You can also go up to the content item in the nav. Which will allow you to launch any of your topic folders, for example, and content items via this launch unit function, or you can click on individual links within to open those. So this is the student experience, remember, not our experience as instructors. And I just wanted to bring you in here to show you the option the students have called the hamburger menu, or its full name being expandable navigation sidebar.
Hamburger is much more delicious.
It is, right? It makes me hungry just thinking about it. But when you open up the hamburger menu, it allows the student to then jump between individual items within the folder, which for those of us coming from I2, where we had that kind of top-down view to be able to open folders and items and jump between them, is probably comfort food to keep that theme going. I notice I've got a question going already. Amy, what's happening there?
Hi, Lachlan. Just curious if we will retain the term course instead of subject.
Our existing terminology continues, but at the moment you're going to find that there may be some inconsistencies in the terms that you're seeing inside Brightspace. That's iterating over time, and we'll cover some of those today, but we still call our subjects subjects, and we still call our programs of study courses as a general mode of operation. So that hasn't changed for how we operate. It's just that the system within itself has some other terms that will change via language pack updates. But at the moment, there are some inconsistencies that we'll point out when we're looking at it today. Thanks, Tanya. Okay, let's continue along with our initial tour. I'm going to jump out of my student view here by clicking on the profile again. And this is a good time for me to mention that this top area within Brightspace, so the navigation, once you go in, is referred to as a mini bar. So we looked at the waffle, the subject selector up here, but it also has a number of other icons that both yourself and students will be able to see. And if I jump out of being a learner, so let's change this and make sure that I'm looking at this as an instructor. What we have, as I mentioned, is the subject selector. We've also got a subscriptions alerts icon, which means if you've subscribed to any aspect of the subject, so for example, discussion board threads, if you've subscribed to certain types of updates, etc., you'll get those alerts appearing here. And that's distinct from update alerts, which basically is about any updates within the subject site at all for you as an instructor. So if there have been any type of content changes, assessments marked, work submitted, comments posted anywhere, any of those updates are going to be captured in here for you as an instructor. You can see those. So that's the mini bar. You'll also find there's a settings cog in there, and that also by clicking on your profile name, there's an area under notifications for you to go in and configure what type of notifications you'd like to receive, either within the LMS or if you'd also like them to come through to you as emails as well. Okay, so I'll close this.
Therese has sorry, tongue-tied. Therese had a question there. Oh, it's in the Q&A tool. Oh, sorry. Let me open that up properly. Oh, sorry, Therese. Apologies, we missed a question and she feels like it doesn't maybe now.
It's just a bit disruptive. Sorry, I was trying to be a bit helpful.
No, sorry. You refer to master sites. Does the subject convener have this site?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the first instance, the subject convener will be emailed once the migration process is finished, telling them that they've now got access to the master subject site. So it'll have that M dash in front of the name. And when you log into Brightspace, when you enter into the system, you're going to see it within your My Subjects area here. You'll be able to jump in either that way or through the subject selector up the top here. You'll see that there are some filters above the My Subjects area as well, one of those being master subjects. So if you've just got access to way too many things and you're needing to narrow that list down within this box, for example, you can use the master subjects option to do that. It also has an org site filter, and then it will also include sessions as filters in there as well. So 2024 30, 2024 60, etc., etc. So it will have that ability if you've been added to session subject sites at some point for particular teaching sessions, they will also appear as filters for you to be able to narrow that search down. So hopefully that answers your question.
So just that, so the so if there's say a distance offering or an online offering and an on-campus offering, so will the on-campus offering, so one, say the online is the master, will the other on-campus one be a a sort of a secondary? How does that work?
Okay, it's a really great question. I'll explain it in a couple of parts. The first part is that within Brightspace, we don't have multiple sites anymore for multiple cohorts. We have a single site that will be used for teaching, which is referred to as a session subject site. And that is provisioned automatically every teaching session 4 weeks before the session begins. Now, that is distinct from what we're looking at today, the master subjects, which is let's say, the optimal version of the subject that is created in here. It will never have any students enrolled into a master subject. And as a general rule, the subject convener and other identified staff will be given access to the master to proof it, validate the content, and make sure that it is fit for purpose. What happens at that 4 week before teaching session commences point is that a snapshot is taken of the master, and that's used to create those teaching sites, the session subject site. Does that clear that up?
Yeah, thank you.
And further beyond that, I will talk briefly about sections within today's session as well, but effectively the way that our different cohorts are handled within that single teaching site is that Brightspace automatically picks up which campuses or which cohorts the enrollments are coming from, and it adds a tag to each of those called a section. And it means that things like assessments and content, discussions, announcements, if you want to target those to particular cohorts of students, we can do that. And so we go into the sectioning, etc., a lot more in some of the other training sessions, but I will be mentioning it a bit later on when we get into assessment shells and how we create those.
And there's a question there. Can anyone create an organization?
Not at the moment. There is a process for applying for either a sandbox or an org site to be created, for example, and a link that points people towards the ticket that needs to be lodged for that to happen. We'll find that as we go through, and we'll drop that into the chat for you. But at the moment, it's not a manual creation process. It does need to go through the project team. All right, let's get into this a little bit more. The other piece of advice that I generally provide to people is that you should, I'll drop a link into the chat, and this is to the Brightspace community website. And I generally encourage people to have this added as a bookmark in your browser. You can sign up and register with the Brightspace community, which will give you access to different types of tutorials and walkthroughs, etc., within the tool. But for me, the most valuable aspect of this tool is the searchable field that's right here at the beginning for anyone that comes in, that you can simply type in the question that you might have, and it will give you access to hundreds, if not thousands, of articles around that particular tool. So it really is quite invaluable if you're after a deeper dive around a particular aspect of this tool that you're not sure about. So I usually have that tool sitting in the background somewhere, come into this page and type in a new term that I'm a little bit unsure about. You can certainly get access to that information in here. Okay, let's continue. What I might do is bring the slides back here for a second. I'm looking at slide 12 in the deck, and we've talked a number of times about this distinction between a master site and a session subject site. The obvious way to distinguish between them is that M- and S- before the subject codes. I've mentioned that the session subject sites are provisioned about a month prior to the teaching session beginning. That happens automatically. The master site is perpetual. It stays there indefinitely. It has no other affix on the end here talking about particular teaching sessions. So it's the obvious way is by looking at the actual code. And what we do within the master site we're looking at today is obviously it's where we curate the content to make sure that it's fit for purpose. There is limited access. The subject convener in the first instance and some other school and faculty-based personnel are given access to the master site. All of the content's visible to you as an instructor. None of it's not available for any reason. I'll make a distinction there before we get into looking at structure and content within Brightspace. You can toggle visibility of any content within Brightspace. When we talk about all content is visible here, it means that you can see it regardless of whether it's made visible or not to students. All of the assessment needs to be created, the assessment shells within the master site, without specific details such as the weighting of the tasks or the due date. That detail is provisioned within subject sites, the session subject sites, but we create the shells within the master. We don't use the gradebook within the master at all. That's reliant on having enrollments, class lists, students in the site, etc. So you'll never be using the gradebook within the master site. And we don't go into details around engagement because there's no enrollments into the master site. The session subject site, it has that specific date marker, obviously. It's where all of our instructors and other staff go in as well as the students. They're enrolled automatically when the session subject site is created. Obviously, only the visible content that you've made either visible or invisible to all students or particular cohorts of students, that those effects come into play in a session subject site. Similarly with assessments. So if you've, unless you've deployed an assessment, and we go into that in the engage assess sessions, it's not going to be visible to students. But you as an instructor will see all of those different assessment drafts and different cohorts assessments, etc. yourself. The gradebook comes into play in the session subject site, and we also get into some of our reporting metrics in there as well. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit about the difference between a master and a session subject session site. But we do talk about use those terms a lot. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the subject migration process, and we'll start looking at what that looks like when you jump into a master subject site. But effectively, and I'm referring to slide 13 at this point in the deck, we have over a decade effectively of processes happening within Blackboard Interact 2, where all of our content, our assessment, and in many cases, our support resources and administrative information has all been collected in the same place, in the same way. And that is obviously the navigation along the left-hand side within our Interact 2 sites. So in case you've forgotten, all of this along the left-hand side. So that has evolved over time, our navigation, our interface, for example, all being collected there, regardless of whether it was specific to being learning material centric, assessment related, as I said, maybe it was communication tools. All of it has gone into the same place, into the same area, and has become somewhat overcrowded. I'll stop there for a second. I can see Amy giving me the wave.
Just had a couple of questions in chat.
Sure.
Okay, so once a session site is running, can you make changes to the master site, and are they automatically added to the subject site?
Okay, it's a great question. The answer is no. If you make changes within your session subject site, the teaching site, which of course is pretty standard practice for our instructors, they're going to be updating different bits of material. That's fine within the session site, but it doesn't flow back automatically into the master. At some point, someone will need to take carriage of reviewing what's happened during the session and then updating the master if necessary. So your time for really updating the master, nothing is going to stop you from updating it as a subject convener, for example, whenever you want to update it. But that's not going to flow through from the master into your session subject site unless it is at that point where we provision the session subject site. I mentioned that before. It happens roughly 4 weeks before the session begins. At that point, it's going to take the most up to like the current version of the master subject site. So at that point, if you want updates to be made for the teaching session, it has to happen within the session subject site. If you keep making changes to the master after that point, it's not going to flow through, but it will flow through the next session afterwards when the next snapshot is taken. So
Awesome.
Hopefully that answers that
That
question.
captured a couple of them in a row, to be honest. They were all around the same thing. Therese just asked as well, are we still able to have a student view when preparing the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. You can switch to that learner view. And another way to, I guess, check a bit of a hack, I suppose, is that if you get the Brightspace app on your mobile device, the Pulse app, you can also log into the subject, like the master site that you're working on, and see what the content looks like to students through there as well. So you can either keep toggling that view that we've mentioned, jumping between instructor and learner view by clicking on the profile, view as learner. That can happen in any site in Brightspace. So any others, Amy?
Nope, grabbed them all.
Okay, great. All right, so look, basically what we're saying is we've come from this environment where everything has gone into this nav along the left-hand side in some way, and we also had a few menu options up here on the right-hand side. Brightspace does a great job of actually separating those out into very distinct structures. And what I'm getting at there is if we jump into any of these master sites, I'll jump into this marketing one here, you'll see that it separates out some of those very clearly. So content, for example, the content menu item is intended to be learning materials. And the reason for that comes into play when we look at how these widgets work, where it's showing progression markers within the thumbnail view. So it shows the student, the user, whoever's going in there, how many of those have been accessed. Instructors can also get hold of analytics, which indicate how students are progressing against those, so they can get reports on how much of the content and which content items are being accessed, etc. For those to be meaningful, obviously, we need the content area to contain learning materials rather than other objects, for example. Communication tools, things like online meetings, Zoom, etc., are separated out into the communication nested menu that we have here. And then our assessments and the tools for submitting those and accessing the information for them are captured here underneath the assessment nested menu. So you just see that those are some examples of how what we were previously dealing with within I2 has been separated out. We don't expect you to discover all of those necessarily yourselves. We've actually consolidated the information around the changes from the I2 interface into Brightspace within a document that's called the Migration and Equivalence Table. And I'm going to drop that into the chat for you, so you've got a copy of it. And I have a shortcut to that file within the slide deck, if I can find that, which is on slide 14. So I'll grab the link to that and put it here for you. That will give you a PDF view or breakdown of what's happened to all of those items that we've been using within Blackboard and what they look like now in Brightspace. So I'm not going to run through them all here, but what you're going to find is that some areas have been migrated, look the same, etc. The materials have been brought across by the migration team, and others haven't, or potentially have been moved into other spaces. So an example is what we previously had within Interact 2 on our home pages. If you had a welcome area, or might have been called home within your I2 menu, for example, that's been brought across into a content folder within Brightspace, and it will be called Welcome. So the first folder within Brightspace is always called, the first content folder is always called Welcome. There is a specific reason for that, and I'll show you why that's happened. But that's taken information that was previously sitting on your landing page within Interact 2. As opposed to the Getting Started area, for example, which is not being migrated. However, if you have any information within your subject site which you think needs to go into the Welcome area, it'll need to be populated in there now, as the Getting Started folder does not exist. You'll also find that some of the tools that you previously were expecting to see, things like EASE, for example, do not exist within Brightspace, and those are generally marked with red within the table here. So do take the time to have a look through the equivalence table, or keep it handy, so that if you're not sure where something has gone now, you'll be able to refer to that quickly. All right, so that's the migration equivalence table. I'll move this across here and keep moving. What you're also going to find within your migrated subject sites, let's have a look at this one. If we jump into the content area as an instructor, and you're going to find within Brightspace that there are generally multiple ways, at least 2, sometimes 3 ways of getting to the same outcome. So with content, for example, instructors can either use the My Topics widget to jump into folders. You can click on content, or you can also go into the course admin area, and I will be referring to this quite often, how often you can find different ways of getting to things. But under course admin, you'll find that there is a link to your content here under site resources. So if you ever get lost and can't find where something is, do come into course admin and you'll be able to find it in there. For today, I'm going to be using the content option mostly to open up our files and folders view of Brightspace. Students do not get this view. As we saw before, their view is quite different. Instructors get these folders that we can open up, and then sitting within them will be content items. We would have called them in Blackboard in Interact 2. Brightspace has a different term for this general building block. They're called HTML pages. But that term effectively is, it just refers to what we would have called content items in Blackboard. And if we open up some of these folders, for example, we can see that the topics within this master site have been carefully labeled. They've used numbering conventions within them, for example. Most of them are pages of content. If we click on each of those, scroll through, but you'll also see that there are some other objects in there that we'll have a look at, including the checklist tool. We'll get to that a bit later on. But our view as an instructor, when we click on content, is this view of files and folders that we can open up. And I'm also going to point out at this stage is that some of these objects may have an eye with a line through it, indicating that that particular object has been hidden. So you can see a visibility toggle here for instructors. Students don't get that. If we toggle that, you'll see that the items within your content area may have been hidden by the migration team. What that generally means is that you're expected to have a look at those and decide what to do with the content there, and if it needs to be repurposed, put somewhere else, deleted, etc. But some of that information within the migration equivalence table that I gave you beforehand will talk about the need for that type of action. And so really you're going to need to decide if there are any hidden areas within your migrated master site that need that action. So it's one of the first kind of call out areas that we have within the slide deck for today. You'll notice on slide 17, there are 2 questions in there, and they refer to the migration outcome report. So I'm going to find a master site that has gone through the migration process in just a moment and show you exactly what I'm talking about when we talk about the migration outcome report. Amy, there's probably been a couple of questions over there since I've been going.
There's a couple. So I just answered one, but how big should each page be? Oh, that's an interesting question.
It's a really great question. Was that Linda, was it? Yeah.
Always Linda with the good questions.
Linda with the good questions. I think what we need to keep in mind is that the student view within Brightspace, and we did have a look at that before. Let's bring that up. Have I logged in as a student here? That's the question. Yes, I have. All right, if I open up this student view and go into my content, I'll launch any of these particular files and folders. This will do, learning resources. Okay, arterial blood supply. Let's get into that. I'll open the hamburger menu. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I would be using what this interface looks like to you when you view this as a student to help guide how big you think this should be. The reason for that is that the way that we move through content in Brightspace as a student is using these arrows. So it is a click through and arguably content on a single screen experience to move between the different items within your topic folders. So instead of literally scrolling down the page indefinitely between one content item and another, which is what we've been doing in Interact 2, we now have this interface and way of moving between content. So this is a roundabout way of me saying, personally, I would be looking for not much more than one page full of content necessarily, maybe a little bit of scrolling, but the intention here is that this is chunked up, and it certainly is handled that way by the migration team, is that they will put each of those individual content items from I2 into separate pages here, but really it shouldn't be pages and pages of scrolling happening, moving through each of those items. Does that answer the question in a way, Linda? What do you think?
Yeah, that's what I was feeling, that I wanted to have lots of different pages rather than a big long single page. But I wanted to check if that's what you were thinking as well, because that's quite different from what we've been doing on Interact.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing that plays into this again is the view through mobile devices. If you're accessing the content through a tablet or a phone, your ability to move through those individual items and digest the content that's within them is a lot easier when it's chunked up like that into smaller digestible kind of pages. So really, I wouldn't be going for much more than a kind of a page, maybe two at most, of when you're actually scrolling through the content.
It also means that
yep.
the bar to keep track of what people have looked at and what they've done works a lot better if you've got it chunked into small bits.
Look, absolutely. It's a lot more granular, and it means that you can really narrow down into what pieces of the content they're engaging with or not. Yep, it's a great point. All right, let's get back in here. I want to find a subject site that's gone through migration but still has, let's try this one. Still has the migration report. Now I'm looking particularly at, where does it sit within the slide deck? Here we go, slide 16. If I get into the content, is there a migration report waiting for us here? No, there is not. All right, let me find a different subject.
Try BMS 255.
BMS 255, I'll give it a crack.
That's some permission right there, Lockie.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that assist. What we have going on here is that as soon as the subject's been migrated and you're notified that it's there and you have access to it, the very first folder that's going to sit within your content area as an instructor, if we open up content, is called Read First Post Migration, and it is hidden. So this is what you can expect to see when you get in there. It's a folder, so we can open it up. And then within that is an item called the migration outcome, or the migration outcome report. And it is a breakdown of what the migration team have done in moving across the content from Interact 2 into the Brightspace master subject site. They'll tell you which subject site in I2 it's come from, for example. And here we can see a particular cohort, a session that it's come from, and the code. And then there's a series of comments that appear within the report. Now, by and large, the first 5 items on this list are fairly uniform. They apply and they'll be done to every subject site. And then as you get towards the end, you're going to notice some specifics that are generally going to have either different colored text or information about what's been highlighted that might be quite specific to this subject. But by and large, you need to work through this to make sure you're across the changes, if any, that have been made. We'll talk a little bit more about quiz pools later on when we get into assessment, but effectively what's happening there is that they'll migrate all the question pools across and the information about the quiz instances, but quite a lot of scrutiny needs to be done around that before they can be used within Brightspace. Assessment information that previously might have sat within an Interact 2 site, for example, in assessment content folders, will have been migrated but hidden, because we no longer keep our assessment information within the area of Brightspace that we would call content. It'll need to be sitting underneath assessment. So that information gets migrated. It will sit within this collection of folders for you to look at, and it will be hidden. So you'll see that mentioned there as number 3. Blogs, journals, and wikis, we don't have those tools within Brightspace. So if there were a reference to those or assessment types like that, they're telling you that any reference to those would need to be updated. Anything that refers to Blackboard or Interact 2 will have been yanked out of the content that's been migrated. That's part of the scrutiny that the migration team do. And that's point 7 there. It's been highlighted or removed, so that you need to look at that. And if there were any issues at all with links, videos, etc., where there are problems, those will have been highlighted. So mostly what the migration team will do is try to make sure that those are functional in the new environment. But if there are problems with them already within Blackboard, they won't have rectified those. They'll have been moved across and highlighted, saying there's still a problem with this. We will talk a little bit about video content like Panopto content as well as part of today's session, and we'll get to that. Lastly, the last part of the migration outcome report is information around any further action needed with this content or support. You're encouraged to log a service request through the DLT desk, and then you'll be assigned obviously an LRO or an ED, etc., to help you work with the content. Linda.
You're on mute.
I was just apologising for taking over the discussion a bit. If you have a look down at one of the content areas there, you'll see everything has been put in the same page. So is that just a matter of copying and pasting it across, or is there a quick way to split it up into?
What particular folder are we getting at?
So where are we? Just pick one week there. Week 11 would be a good one to look at. Or
okay. Have I jumped ahead? Oh, here we go.
Whichever week you like.
So I've got a hidden folder here. There's a hidden folder, and
everything from that week is just all in the one.
Right.
That doesn't. That one's not. So have a look a bit earlier on. There's some that have just got, video after video and all kinds of things, all just in the one file.
Right. So they've just moved it across. Were they
be
previously separate content areas within I2, or are they all in the one page?
They were on the one page, but separate units, I think, separate items. Does that make sense?
We might have to take it offline to have a look at it. Yeah, but basically you can certainly move content around quite easily and reprovision it from one part to another. We'll go through that when we look at the content tools. Yeah, it's we'll get into that. Okay, so the point being is that you'll need to have a look at your migration report and work through it and action any of the items that are called out there. Got a question there from Therese. Will they include the video links from I2? So when you say video links in I2, are we talking about video that was stored in I2? or was it pointing to I2, or was it pointing to somewhere else? What do you mean,
No,
Therese?
I think since you've shown me another slide, it looks like those video links. So if you had a YouTube clip that outlined a particular concept, for example, that you had a link to, that will come across as part of the migration into these modules or these.
That's right. It'll be re-embedded by the migration team as a YouTube clip. We saw one of those earlier on as well, and I can show you an example as well of Panopto videos. If we have a look, generally nursing has Panopto videos going on. Let's have a look in there. If we get into some of the content that they have within each of their modules, there is always subtopics. Within their subtopics, they then have videos. So these are Panopto videos that have then been re-embedded within the content areas.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
And Samantha had a question or maybe a comment. I found not all of the issues are highlighted. I manually went through and checked everything and found multiple issues which are easy to fix but weren't highlighted.
Yeah, right. Well, I think there's certainly a checklist that the migration team work through, but if there are significant items from that missing that that we can let them know might need to be included in that process, I would encourage you to provide that feedback to the Polaris at CSU email address, and then that way they can adjust their processes if necessary. Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, no, that was it was just more of a comment, you know, just so others are aware of how, because I've already gone through all of the master subjects, the vast majority of them in terms of their links, readings, all the links in relation to it, they don't work, so they'll need to all be redone again.
Right, and were those?
It's an absolutely easy fix, but just something for people to be aware of.
And those links were working within Interact 2 sites, but once they were migrated, were not working.
Yeah.
Right. Were they pointing to things inside I2 or external?
They were external.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Well, we might need to look into what's happened there, Samantha. But yeah, I'm glad that they were easily fixed for you at least.
I do have another question. The videos that are stored for Panopto within the Panopto file on I2, they haven't migrated over to the master site. Is that not supposed to happen, or?
Right. So what is meant to happen with Panopto, well, I'll get to Panopto videos in a little bit, but basically, if they're part of the learning materials, like they've been embedded within your learning materials in the subject site, then they will move those into a Panopto master folder for the subject and then re-embed them within the learning materials. But if they just sat within the actual session-based folder, if you were using one of those within I2, they won't have been migrated because that's pointing to one particular teaching session. So we might need to look specifically at how the video content has been stored, whether you're using a master or an individual session-based folder, but we can take that one offline and follow it up for you.
Yeah, because it was across all of the subjects. I think there's about 10 of them because we just store all the lectures in the Panopto file, not embedded under each week.
Okay, you should definitely. That's a really interesting one. Yeah, I might talk to you about that afterwards if I can.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about learning material structure. I know we can see a couple of other questions coming in, but we'll I'll stop again briefly shortly and we'll get to some of those if Amy's not able to answer those in the chat. Structure within Brightspace, within our subject sites, is intended to take into account what the learner experience looks like, particularly that mobile view, for example, if they're looking at the content on mobile devices. And that comes into play when we talk about the level of hierarchy that we have within Brightspace. And what I'm getting at particularly here is that you'll see when you first come in that you have a collection of top-level folders within Brightspace. They're referred to here as units. Don't be thrown by the terminology. It's just literally the top-level folder. You may see a language pack change, which changes this word to the word topics, for example. But again, it's just the top level folder and the items contained within those. We also have the ability to create subfolders within those. And you'll see that, for example, over here on the right-hand side, you've got the option to either add existing content or create new. And if we were so inclined, clicking on create new, you'll see a folder icon here, and it's cleverly called new lesson. Again, don't be thrown by the terminology here. It's just a subfolder, right? You're not meant to be guided by what its intended use case is here. It's literally how we add a subfolder to then add more content within. And that example that I showed you a minute ago with a nursing subject, for example, they have their level of top folders that we can see here. And then within some of those, they have one layer of subfolders that they're calling those their topics, for example. And what we're saying here is that you really should only have 2 tiers of content within Brightspace. You shouldn't have more subfolders beyond those first, that first sublayer there. So 2 levels of folders, top level, 1 sublevel. Don't create more than that, because it's going to impact on how students can view the content or not. There's problems with it once you start going to 2 subfolders and beyond. So you can have as many of these subfolders as you like at that second layer, but you can't then create further subfolders beyond that without it impacting the student experience. Does that make sense? Yep, 2 layers of folders. Stick to 2 layers. That's it. All right, and within those folders or subfolders, as many of these content items as you wish. And we'll get into how we create those in just a moment. I did talk briefly before about this welcome folder, and I'd like to get into why that's important. What it comes down to is that the first visible folder for students is called welcome. It contains information you previously had on your homepage, or perhaps you've taken some information out of getting started, etc., to put into yours. And it is important because this is the first piece of information the students will see when they come into their subjects. And the way that that happens for them is through a tool called the welcome widget. So I'd like to show you a teaching site where there is a welcome widget happening, just so we can see what that means. If I have a look at my student view, let's see if it's still visible to me from my subject homepage. Right down the bottom, there it is. So this is what happens, assuming that this has not frozen on me somehow. Maybe it has, because this is Edge. Oh, sorry, just give me a moment. We'll jump out of there, jump into the subject site as the student. Now, let's try that again. No, it's given me grief. I think this might be a Firefox thing. What I'm getting at here, if I can open my training site, for example. Let's try it again. It's not even appearing for me there. Wonderful. Let's get into QA. Slight technical hitch. Thank God. Okay. So what we have here is the welcome widget. What the welcome widget does is that it will automatically display to first-time users of the subject site whatever content you have sitting in your welcome folder. So what you can see here, let's imagine that I'm a student coming into the subject site, but it works the same for staff. Whatever content was stored in that folder will then be displayed, and the student and the staff member will need to scroll to the bottom of that content to then be able to see this dismiss button, at which point it will no longer pop up for them. So it is a way of guaranteeing that they see the information that's in that first folder. They have to see it, scroll through it to be able to dismiss it. If they close it before scrolling through it to the end, it's going to pop up for them the next time as well. So the only way to stop the welcome widget functioning like that as a pop-up is to scroll through the content to be able to hit dismiss. So what that means at that point is that whatever content you're putting into that folder, into the welcome folder, has to be put together with that in mind. This is information that students will absolutely have to engage with. And that's why the first folder must be called welcome, and you can't actually adjust the name of the folder, otherwise it will impact whether or not that tool works. Now, I noticed there was a question there around preferred browsers. My experience so far over sort of, I guess, 8 and something years at CSU is that I would be sticking to Chrome for just about everything these days. I haven't had any issues with Firefox until this morning. It's worked fine. But as a general rule, I steer people towards using Chrome. Yep. That's a really good question, Nicole. I haven't had it prevented for me where I have pop-up blockers. So I've got one going on, for example. I've got ad blocker happening here, which also stops pop-ups, but I might take that as something to follow up as well. So not that I'm aware of, but we'll have a look. Thank you for that. Amy, where are we at in terms of questions and things? Have I got a bunch that I've missed?
I was just trying to find a response for Travis that made sense, but I might just ask since you've paused for a sippy sip of your water there. So Travis was wanting to know, can we have a glossary that is shared across multiple subjects?
Okay, so there is a glossary tool. You may have found it within Brightspace underneath course admin. It is subject specific. That's the problem. So there isn't a way to make that the same glossary accessible across multiple subjects. You can
Could you attach it
export
to your course site?
Yeah, well, you can export you could put it in something central that students have access to from different areas, like a course site, for example. You could create a glossary in a course site and that they could access it from there. But it isn't something that is then the same object available within multiple different subjects, because they will each have their own individual glossary tool. Yeah.
And
Any
then
others?
I think you kind of answered what happens if we have 2 or more layers of folders or subfolders. Will it restrict what the student? Yeah.
It's not going to stop you creating them, but it makes waves for students trying to view the content on mobile devices. It won't open up that third sublayer properly.
Yep. And then Stuart just had a question. Where do we anticipate that academic contacts will be contained?
I think when the development work is done, it will appear on the subject homepage, Stuart. I would be expecting it to be one of the widgets that are available, but it's not there currently. So that means that any contact information obviously is contained within the subject outline, but that also I would be updating your welcome folder so that the welcome item includes the contact information. Yep.
And no, there's just a comment from Tanya about the glitch in i2 where if you use Safari, you can't get past the Panopto welcome video. And that there's a fix of adjusting the security setting on the Apple device to allow cross-tracking.
It's on mobile devices. Yes, there is an issue with iOS and playing back Panopto videos. You're absolutely right.
And a point of interest in case that welcome site is impacted too here.
It's not impacted when you look at it on a computer, like on a PC, for example. But if there is video content contained within it, Panopto video content, for example, then it does have that same glitch at the moment. It has been reported to the vendor though, so hopefully they get on to fixing that as well. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think we've caught everybody up, and I'll stop typing half of my sentences, and we'll.
Just on the welcome page, Lachlan. So what you're saying is that there will, in effect, be 2 welcome pages. There'll be one there, there'll be static, and that's duplicated in the widget.
Well, you've got the folder, which, if, for example, we were looking at any of these areas. So there's one here, for example. So when we've got our files and folders view as an instructor, and we come in and have a look at this content that's in there, that is what's going to be captured to students when they come in and get the welcome widget popping up on them until they dismiss it. If you update this content and change it, then that updated content will be displayed. So it's dynamic in the sense that the widget will pick up whatever content has been added within this folder. Its job is to simply display whatever content. If there's one page or multiple pages within this folder, they will all display within the welcome widget, scrolling one after the other.
But if they dismiss it, then how are they going to go back and get academic contacts?
So, for example, a student would still be able to come into their content area and see the welcome sitting there as the first folder. It's just that it doesn't pop up on them on the landing page.
Okay. Now, just while you're there, notice that read first post migration is a hidden item.
Yep.
If you go into student view and then go into their content selection, they can actually select that. So I'm wondering if the student view is not a proper student view.
Yeah, it's a good point. So genuine students can't see it, but when you switch to learner view, it's still picking up that Stuart McKinney is actually an instructor, and hence you can still see hidden objects. So yeah, it is definitely hidden from the students, but when you switch to learner view as an instructor, it still displays some of those visibility impacted objects. So it's not a real student. That's why I like using the mobile app to have a look at the content. Look and feel, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely hidden from them, but when instructors use that learner view, there are some areas of it which are less than ideal because it still shows you other bits and pieces as well. It's a good point.
And I just pointed out, Lachlan, because at this stage, we don't know how pervasive that is when we go to look at students in other aspects. If we're doing quizzes, if we're doing all sorts of things, and we say, well, how does this look like for a student? We may not be getting an actual student view. So just something to be alert of. Yeah,
that's generally another reason why I use the mobile app as well, so that I can actually look at that to get a genuine indication of what the content looks like for students, because it displays it first and foremost as the student view. Have a look at it. Yep. All right, we need to pick the pace up a little bit so that we can spend enough time on assessments on the back end. So I want to have a look at some of the tool set that we use within Brightspace for editing our content. And what I might do is open up a sandbox to do that. Let's go into here. Okay, if I open up my content view, what we're going to find is that we have a number of ways of storing content within Brightspace. So we've come from I2, obviously, where we were using our content collections, and that still exists in Brightspace to some extent. They have a manage files option that sits within your course admin. So this is kind of the back end, so to speak, of your subject storage, and you'll find it underneath your site resources, manage files. So if you're curious as to where your files, etc., are going and where they sit, not visible to students, but just sitting within the actual subject site to be used or not used, they all sit within the manage files folder, which has replaced what we would call our content collection within Interact 2. What we also have is the ability, when we add content, to add files locally. And so I think what I want to take you through is how we add content into our folders. So I mentioned before that we've got our top level of files, of folders with files in them that you'll see after migration. You have the ability to add in new folders if you're so inclined, clicking on New Unit. That will add in an additional folder at the bottom. If we click within any of those given folders, you'll see the option on the right-hand side here to either add existing or create new. I'm going to click on Create New here, and that gives us the view of either creating subfolders, or what I'm going to do here is add in a new HTML document, which has replaced what we would call content items in I2. So anything that was a content item in your subject sites, it'll be migrated as a HTML file. This doesn't mean that you need to know anything about coding or HTML, for example. It's just a page within this LMS. So if I create new content page in here, I'll just call it that, you'll notice that straight away you have the ability to add due dates against any of your content items, keeping in mind that working within a master site, we don't want to add any specific date bindings to our objects, whether content or assessment, because this is going to be reused session after session after session. So if you're inclined to start restricting content or assessment by date, it's not that it's a bad idea, it's just that you should be doing it within the session subject site once it's provisioned rather than the master. When we work within the Brightspace editor, you'll hear reference to a term called WYSIWYG, which stands for what you see is what you get. And that just means this toolbar that you can see here appearing all over the place in Brightspace. It's there for assessments, discussions, announcements within your content areas, and it's just referring to this toolbar. And the Brightspace WYSIWYG is quite powerful, but very simple to use. Along with the formatting that's in place here, your base options, you also have a tool called Insert Stuff. If you click on that, you'll see that this gives you the ability to add content in from external sources, such as uploading it from your computer. You can get it from Panopto, embed video from Panopto from here as well. There are integrations to a number of other services that we use at the university, such as LT, for example. You can also get it from course offering files, which is talking about that manage files folder I was pointing you to a minute ago. So if there are folders that you just add, files that you added in there, you could retrieve them from here. There is also a tool within Brightspace called the Learning Object Repository, which is a way of sharing content not only across your own subjects, but also with peers. It's not replacing DOMs at this point in time. We're still using DOMs, but you can store content within the learning repository, and then you'll be able to retrieve that elsewhere. There's a term in here that talks about video notes. And what that means is it actually will utilize your webcam and your headset to capture content on the fly, audio, video content. You can make that as audio only if you're wanting to do that, but you can add that sort of content as you go. Any files that you create like that, audio or video files, will automatically be stored within the Brightspace media library. Sorry, was there a question there? No?
I did hear a voice.
So did I, but that's okay. I always hear the voices.
Hear the voices, yeah.
Yeah. You'll see here that there's also an option for YouTube. So that tool will allow you to search for YouTube videos and then embed them directly. As well as a couple of other tools like Flickr. You can embed a hyperlink here or embed code. So if you're working with interactives, for example, that have been made in other tools like H5P, Mentimeter, etc., Padlet, you can still get the embed code and drop them straight into your content areas here as well, all using the Insert Stuff option. So it is quite powerful. And that can be dropped into a lot of different areas, not just your learning materials as such. You'll also find within the WYSIWYG that there is, if we hit the plus here, there are some other tools that we can also utilize. We talk about these a little bit in the slide deck further on, somewhere around slide 30 or so, I'm guessing. And the ones I want to point out to you that might be new for you are the Insert Element and Insert Practice options. So Insert Element, you'll see, are interactives that don't require data or information from the user. So it's just a way of reorganizing information. So if you were looking at creating accordions or click and reveals, flip cards, etc., within the subject site, that would be done using Insert Element. We know that sorry, go ahead.
Just a question that's probably timely. Is H5P part of the tool set, or do we need to create the H5P outside of Brightspace?
So you create it outside of Brightspace. If you've been using H5P before, you can continue to use that, but there are some options in here that might replace the need for you to use H5P, and they are native to Brightspace, which means we can also get some analytics around their use.
And Tanya's a spell check?
A spell check, absolutely. Let's see, there is an accessibility checker that is built in here, and I feel like it also includes a spell check. I'm going to need
we get the
to check
squiggles
that
under
for
the
you.
lines too, though, don't we? We get like the little...
Yeah, it picks it up automatically, so it's
little...
built in. So if I was to spell the word accessibility the wrong way, it's building in the spell check on the spot. I mentioned the accessibility checker. This icon with a tick underneath it will investigate all of the content that happens within the editor for you. And it'll make sure that it meets WCAG standards, for example. So there's an accessibility checker built in. I'm not sure about US spelling, but we might need to check that out.
Interesting question. Yeah, I just was just about to ask. Take that
All
away.
right. I want to get to the other tool that's available in here for you, Insert Practice, just so I can round out that whether or not you want to use Insert Element or Insert Practice. The main difference being that Insert Practice refers to interactives that require information from the user, so data from the user. So you make choices, you provide information in the interactive, as opposed to the elements, which are just ways of reorganizing the information. All right. Someone mentioned select template, and I'm glad you've done that. The migration team has applied templating to the way that your content has been migrated across. And the way that we make sure that the content stays uniform is through the use of templates within the content area. If we click on the select template option, you'll see that there is a growing list of templated objects that you can choose from. I'm going to choose the blank one, and I usually do, to be honest. And what that applies immediately is the font size, etc., and type for both a heading and content that you can then start typing into, and it will apply those same settings to your content. The other thing that you can do with this template is if you're copying and pasting content from somewhere else, you can do that. And when you paste it in here, providing that you've selected the template first, it will apply those same styles to the content that you paste in here. Right, so that is a way for you to quickly apply the same theming, if you will, the same template styles to the content that you paste within. Your safest bet, if you're looking for a foolproof process, is to copy the content, if it's coming from i2, for example, paste it into a Word doc, remove all the formatting, and then paste it in here. That if you're worried about sort of code and other things being picked up along the way, but you can certainly just copy it directly and paste it in here. And I haven't had any issues with doing that myself so far. All right, let's continue on. Video content. Now, we did mention this earlier that there are a couple of ways of doing that. One of them being the YouTube tool that's there, or you can certainly take the embed code from a YouTube video and drop it in using the insert stuff option. And YouTube, for example, you could take that if you just had the link to the video. If you had the embed code, you can drop that in down the bottom there. The other option is Panopto. And at that point, you're going to need to browse for the Panopto master folder that the content is coming from. So there is some challenge that we have to overcome with Panopto as we transition from the old system to the new. You'll find that there is a master folder that exists for Blackboard subjects, and there'll be a master folder that will be created for the Brightspace subjects. Now, all of that will be moved across automatically once that change is finished. But what I'm saying is that if you're embedding video from Panopto using the deep link tool, you're going to have to browse to find the right folder that the video sits within before you embed it. There's more nuance to it than that, but if you want to talk about Panopto more with me, we can do it outside of the session today. Because I know that can be a bit of a rabbit hole.
It sounds like a session of its own, the whole Panopto situation.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I also mentioned the media library if you're creating content on the fly, audio, video content from your webcam and your headset. You can also embed that way. Okay, interactives like Padlet, H5P, and Menti stay the same. You just drop in the embed code. All right, how far along are we here with the slide deck? We talked about insert stuff. Right, the checklist tool. I will show you the checklist tool briefly. The way that we add that, I might just save this, we'll leave it there. The other thing to note is that every new content item and folder that you create will be hidden by default. So you will need to toggle it as visible once you're happy with it. I will point out to you that once we get into our session subject sites, content, like many other objects in Brightspace, can be restricted so that only particular cohorts can see it. We don't do this within the master site. If you've got content that you only want certain cohorts to be able to see, what I would be doing is making sure that you very clearly label your folders and your content items that you want for those cohorts. So if I wanted this to be only for Bathurst distance students, for example, maybe I'd be putting either Bathurst distance or a shorter version into the title, because ultimately what we're going to be doing in the session subject site is implementing that restriction. And that happens here underneath availability dates and conditions. There's a release condition option down the bottom there. And what we're doing is we'd actually use add existing, and we would be pointing to the cohort that we want to be able to see it. I'm not going to go into that today because that's talking about session subject sites, but I always get asked, what about content for particular cohorts? All you need to do in the master is make sure that you've created folders for each of the cohorts if you're going to be limiting it to different cohorts of students. So if I've got 2 cohorts of students and I want to make sure that they can both see it, I don't need to do anything. They can just use the same folder structure. But if I want to limit it to 1, I'm going to need to duplicate. Yep.
Can you hide text for instructors only on the page level?
You can hide the page, but not within the page. Does that make sense, Linda? So yeah,
That'd
you
be
could
more
definitely
fun.
hide the
Secret
page,
codes in there, hey?
but not within the actual page content itself.
I like
I
the
was
way
thinking,
Linda thinks.
I was thinking more about instructions on, you know, how to run the session, or, you know, it's intended that this be used in, do you know what I mean? That you've got with your content for the students,
You could put
you've
a page
got the
before the page, I
information for the instructors as well.
I mean, you could do it as a hidden page, for example, that only the instructors see, but you can't do it within the actual page if it's made visible to the students. There's no subsection of that, which is instructor only, that I'm aware of.
Maybe we can sell that idea.
Yeah,
Let's
absolutely.
put it on the list.
All right, I'm going to close this, as time always gets away from me in this session. There's just so much to cover. All right, I talked a little bit about checklists. One of the options for things that you can add into your content, you may have seen before at another page the word checklist appearing. Brightspace has a checklist tool. If I can find a page where we have one that I could show you. I've got one in the sandbox, I'm sure. Open up a folder. Is there a checklist in here somewhere? There's a checklist. No. No, it's not there. Not in this site. It's a quiz. That's not going to help me. Too many folders and subfolders. Yeah, no dice. All right, let's go through another site. I should be able to find one. It's because I'm in QA. That's why, Lachlan. That's why. That's better. Okay, if I change to my learner view, what they're going to do is get prompted with the option to open a checklist. So we better make sure I'm looking at this as a student. Content. There's a checklist. Okay, so what the checklist tool looks like once it's been created is you'll find that it'll have a progression marker showing how far the student has worked through the items on the checklist as they check each of these boxes. That'll update. You can organize it into sections or categories under different headings, and that each of those items not only the student can use it as a to-do list, for example, whether that's at the module level or if you're using it for actions to be completed each week, for example, or any purpose at all, you can create these checklists, and then the instructors can also get the data around where students are up to within the checklist. So they're valuable to both the student and the instructor, and then they can be situated within your content, for example, attached to announcements, put in as items into your activity feed, for example. But how you utilize the checklist, obviously, or however many checklists you choose to create is up to you. But that's how it appears to students. And creating them is very, very simple. The process is very straightforward to work through. So I'm going to jump out of being a learner here. Yeah, they're not automated, Phil. The question there on do they need to fill them out manually, or are they picked up automatically? Yeah, they have to check the boxes themselves. They don't update automatically as such. Although certainly the folders that you create, those are updated automatically as people move through the content. But that's not quite the same as what you're asking, I don't think. Yep. All right, let's go through the process of creating one, I guess. Let's do that. Create new and checklist. I'll just show you what they kind of look like once we start creating them. The process is really simple. Sample checklist. You can create a description or instructions if you're so inclined, but if I hit create and insert, it's now going to ask me to open that checklist. And now I can start populating the different areas of it. So categories just means the subheadings in this case. And then each of those will have items underneath. So the actual checklist item that you want them to mark off. It's as simple as that. You work through it. You can use the full WYSIWYG for information contained, not only within the description, but also the item areas. If I open that up, this is what would be displayed to the student as an individual checklist item. And again, you can set due dates against those items within the checklist. What that means is then you have the option for it to appear within their calendars as well. So it's quite integrated. It's not just a standalone set of tasks for them to work through. It will also go into calendars for them. And if they've got notifications and reminders happening, that they're going to be prompted against each of those as well. So it is quite powerful. You just need to work through the process of creating your subheadings, your categories, and the items that you want to appear, and then just keep switching across to the learner view so that you know how it actually appears for them ultimately. But that's the checklist tool, which is arguably one of the more powerful tools that Brightspace makes available to us. All right. I want to show you one more thing to do with the content creation suite, and then we can start hopefully moving into the assessment area. If you're looking to add existing files like Word documents or PDF files and have them appear on the page within Brightspace rather than just as an attachment, you can certainly add it as an attachment. For example, if I have my blank page here, I've got 3 dots up here to the right, so I can edit that if I need to. If I wanted a file attached to this, I can do that, right? And that would be involved, for example, using the insert stuff option. And I could scroll to my computer and I can add a file, right? Which is not going to look amazing, but let's do it anyway. Righto, I'll add the training deck from today. That'll do. If I upload that, you'll see that in text, it appears as this kind of, oh, it's applied the styling from the template. That's wonderful. Anyway, take my word for it. You'd be doing it within your paragraph text rather than your title like I've done there. But it creates this actual file location link. Students can click on that and get the file, but it just doesn't look great. So what I'm actually going to do here instead is I'm going to click on Add Existing. And at that point, I can drag that same file into here, and it renders the file on the page for the students. So at that point, the idea of embedding PDFs and Word documents, Excel, etc. I haven't tried it with a massive variety of file types, but it certainly renders most of the Microsoft Suite objects directly in here, and creates those as content items, which I think is probably going to be far more attractive and appealing to students than the idea of that full file location link thing sitting within the text. So you might want to consider that when you're adding in different types of objects, and that's saved that automatically. When students view the content, they can print those pages directly, but you'll see here that there are also options once it's rendered to be able to print and download, because it treats it as them as effectively as a PDF, and that's hidden by default as well. All right, I mentioned the accessibility checker when you want to actually go over the text and pick up whether any of the images have issues, or the text or the font. I get asked about Ally and whether we're still going to be using Blackboard Ally, or now called Anthology Ally. It's still being looked at. Effectively, there are a couple of options around accessibility that haven't been decided upon at the moment. The one that's available to you within Brightspace is that accessibility checker tool for any of your HTML pages, which if you're editing them, it appears in the WYSIWYG there. Yeah, well, they don't have to click over everything, Linda, unless you start setting up things like release conditions, etc., for subsequent pages. So you can create that kind of restricted access and view. But maybe I can talk to you about that offline. But as a general rule, it's not going to be picked up in that progression indicator on the dashboard that they've moved through the content unless they've accessed it, at least opened the page once. Yeah. All right. I'm going to stop there. Amy, how are we tracking as I get a little bit of water happening?
Just having a little scroll through here. I think you've caught everybody though.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll like tell a joke, do a little dance so you can have like a little break.
Bit of background music, no problem. All right, let's get into assessment. Time is getting away from us. So I'm up to about slide 33. So we'll talk a little bit about sections. We're going to be creating a number of what's called assessment shells in Brightspace, and you're going to need to create one for every cohort and every assessment task that's going to be delivered in the subject. So if you've only got one cohort of students, fine. You only need to create that many assessment shells as you have, for example, within your subject outline. If, however, you've got 3 different cohorts of students when you deliver the subject and 3 assessments, you'll need to create 9 assessment shells. Now, the process for creating an assessment shell and then duplicating it is very, very simple. As long as you've created one, you can click on the drop down next to the actual assessment item and you'll be able to copy it. And it will instantly take the same settings that you'd applied beforehand and allow you to change the name. And then your second one is done at that point. So you can duplicate very easily, but you do need to create one for each assessment task in the first instance. And we're going to walk through that process now of creating assessment shells. It is important when you create any of your assessment types, whether it's a quiz or an assignment or accessible discussion thread, that you identify the intended cohort in brackets as part of the labeling. Do that. We suggest very, very strongly that you also identify the assessment number as well. And the reason for that becomes clearer once we start getting into the setup of our session subject sites, where we have to link our shell to our gradebook columns. And the easiest way to do that is if we can see the cohort and the assessment number. So that's why we're saying part of preparing your assignments, your assessment shells, is to make sure that the labeling is as clear and concise as possible. So I'm going to start by creating a new assessment, and particularly I'm going to look at the assignment tool. So underneath the assessment menu that we have here, up the top, you've got assignments, you've got quizzes and exams as our 2 options. If I go into assignments, the assignment tool replaces EASE. It replaces Turnitin submission portals. And the use case for it primarily is for text-based submission of assessment. Previously, we would have used those two tools that I talked about, either EASE or Turnitin submission portals. When you click on assignments in here, you're going to see probably an empty dashboard. I've got a lot in here because I create these all the time. As you add each of these, they'll appear within the dashboard for you. You'll see some icons to the right of each of the titles that will give you a little bit more information. The most obvious one at this point being that a number of these are hidden, but we'll get into some of the other icons in a little bit. If I create a new assignment, it's going to start walking me through the process of labeling it and setting up conditions. We'll do that in a second. But there's also a section here that talks about categories. This term purely means a subheading that will sit within your dashboard alone. Okay, a category is literally just a subheading for you to be able to order your items underneath. It has nothing to do system-wise with any of your sections, which is our term for our different cohorts. It's just a way for you to organize your assessments as they sit within this dashboard. So if you want to create some subheadings to help you organize them, you would be using this edit categories area to create some of those subheadings here. So I'm going to click new assignment and walk through this process. Here it's asking me for a name. So if I was going to create a new one of these, the first thing I'd probably be doing is identifying which assignment it is according to the subject outlines normally. So if it was normally assessment number 3, then I'd be putting in the name of the assessment. If it had a particular name that wasn't the text type, for example, like an essay or whatever the case may be, you need to make sure that you try and capture that in here as well, so it's clear what sort of task this is. At this point, I'm just going to say essay title. I'll put that in there. Then in brackets, I want to make sure that I identify the cohort that this is intended for, this particular shell. So I'll put in Bathurst distance. As I mentioned before, we don't include the grade and the due date details in the master site when we create the shells. That information goes into the teaching site, the session subject site. Leave those blank. Task instructions. This is up to you what you're going to put in here. And we have usually quite a clear distinction with instructors choosing to put a large amount of information into the task instructions within the LMS, and others choosing to put something along the lines of, for full information on this task, please refer to your subject outline. So what I'm getting at here is this is a choice that you're going to need to make, because there is a clear divide between what people put into the LMS in terms of task instruction, the level of detail, whether you're copying and pasting all of that text that people previously had in their Interact 2 sites underneath assessments, for example, where there was just pages and pages and pages and pages of lots of other information. If you're inclined to provide that within Brightspace, you would be putting it here underneath task instructions. It has the full WYSIWYG, which will allow you to link out to other pieces of information if you wanted, or you can attach files to the instruction as well. So if you had cover sheets or other information that you wanted to happen with the submission, you can provide all of that here in this setup. You can do that, but the level of detail that you provide in here, honestly, is at your discretion. I would definitely be trying to mention that the students should be referring to the subject outlines for at some point in that information, because that's our source of truth. The most up-to-date information should always be within the outline. It has the option here to capture audio and video on the spot as well. Again, that'll turn on your webcam or your headset and then add that as part of the instructions for the student. So if you're looking for a multimodal instruction as such, you can certainly do that. Otherwise, you might be linking to something like Panopto or somewhere else. And then on the right-hand side, we start having some more detail. I'm going to unpack each of these. We don't provide all of this information in the master site. And what I'm getting at is things like availability dates. This, when it talks about availability, it's talking about the visibility of this item to students we would not put this information into the master site. If you were going to put that in, and usually people talk about things like quizzes only being visible at certain points of time, they use start and end dates, but we don't set that up until we get into the session subject site. So as far as creating the shell in the master, that date-based information we don't provide. We also have release condition information in here. We don't provide that in here either. That happens in the session subject site. But I do like to show people that that's where things like provisioning for certain cohorts, that's all configured using these settings. And the last option that we have in here is the special access area, which I'll just show you briefly is how we manage extensions. Is the short form, is that we generally have the ability to choose from the entire class list of students and then decide who is going to get a new due date. And if we were going to push that out by 7 days, for example, we can then do that and apply it to the whole lot. So this is how extensions are managed within Brightspace, within the assignment tool and the quiz tool. We're able to use the special access feature to bulk manage that and push that out so the system gives them a new due date. So it is quite handy, but again, not part of the setup process for our shells in the master. Then we have our submission and completion settings. This is far more relevant to us now when we set up the shell. What sort of task is this? Is it an individual assignment for students, or are we creating a group task? Category simply refers to that subheading before. Don't be thrown by that. Submission type, most of these are going to be file submissions for students, but it is worth seeing the other options that are in here, because there are also options like a text submission, which means they have to type into the assignment tool on the spot. We also have things like observations catered to in here, or an on-paper submission. What that means really for this tool is that you would be attaching a rubric and doing the marking within Brightspace, but the students wouldn't have to do anything else in here, which makes it useful potentially for things like OSCEs or other types of observations. You still have a slot within the system to do the marking for the student against. You'll have rubrics, you'll have the marking tools, but they won't be actually uploading anything. The most common scenario that we're going to be dealing with here is a file submission. How many files do we want them to be able to submit? For example, those of you familiar with the Turnitin submission portals, we could only ever submit one file per portal. Now, it's unlimited, which means the students, if the task requires them to submit several different files, different file types, for example, we can do that. So we can have an unlimited number of files for the submission, or if you only want them to submit the one file, we can do that. Then we get into the extensions, file extensions. What sort of files do we want them to submit? I'm going to steer you towards the bottom option here, compatible with Turnitin, because Turnitin is now part of the workflow that we use within Brightspace for our marking of text-based assessment. That's only going to work for us if the file type is compatible with Turnitin. So most of the time, if you're getting a text-based assessment for students that you want to do a Turnitin check on, come down to the bottom and make sure that what they're submitting is compatible with Turnitin. If for whatever reason the assignment type does not require a Turnitin compatibility check, then you can start looking at some of these other options. Are they submitting images or videos, for example? Are they things like PDFs, or no restrictions is the other common one that I see. But most of the time you're going to be choosing for a text-based assessment that it is compatible with Turnitin. Then the submission rules. Do we want to keep all the submissions, or do we only want to keep the most recent one? That's usually the most common option here. But we do have a full submission log available to our markers, which means we can see all of the attempts that have been submitted, or the drafts, so to speak. But our ability to see all of those previous submission files would only be enabled if you chose keep all submissions. By and large, most people are selecting only the most recent submission is the one that I want to be looking at. Okay, there is an option here for you to put in a notification email at the bottom. I would avoid putting one in there. You probably don't want to be notified directly every time a student submits an assignment. And if you did, there are better ways to do that through our our notification settings, or even using the Brightspace app. So those are our submission and completion settings. I'm going to collapse that area. And then we have our evaluation and feedback settings. Now, look, because just given time today, I actually have 2 quick guides that I'm going to drop into the chat for you to help with this process. One of them takes you through the assignment creation process that I've glossed over quite briefly here, but it takes you through in some detail, including all of these settings. And the other one is to help you create rubrics within Brightspace. So I'll show you how the rubric tool works and what it looks like. But for a more detailed breakdown of that process, I want to point you towards the quick guides for assessment and for rubric creation. I will find those in just a moment. Amy, I'll stop there for a second and see where we're up to in terms of questions and things.
It's actually, yeah, everyone's happy so far. Everyone tracking well.
It's probably a whole lot of information, I guess, yeah. Okay, creating rubrics in Brightspace. We'll start with that one. We'll certainly send you an email afterwards as well. Creating rubrics.
Yeah, so post training, you'll get an email with the slideshow. That's a slideshow, the slide deck, and recording. Potentially, if some of these documentations, if we want those as well. Do you have our recordings for most of the training sessions so far available on the LMS transition webpage, which we can always check out. Our most recent training session yesterday was the Engage training sessions, and those haven't yet been uploaded to our website. So for the simple fact that it was yesterday, we haven't done it yet. Once those are there, the full suite of training videos to cover Adapt, Create, and Engage will all be available.
I think part of the trick is that I'm so used to storing things in Teams now as well that retrieving them makes it quite interesting as well. Let's go with training docs. Anyway, we'll mail them out. Let's get back to looking at the evaluation and feedback options in here. Firstly, you've got the option to add a rubric in here to either create a new one, or if you've got one pre-prepared within the rubric tool in here. And the rubric tool you can find in your course admin menu. If we go to creating a new rubric, again, I'd advise you to work through the quick guide for this. Make sure that you've labeled it quite concisely and accurately in terms of intended task and cohort. Include the assessment number, the title, the cohort, etc. within there. It's got a couple of headings at the top here, analytic versus holistic. Don't use holistic. It means a single criterion rubric. So unless you've got a task that only has one criterion, always use analytic. There's no difference between the two of them apart from the name and the fact that this one lets you have multi-criterion. This one only lets you use the one. So stick to analytic there. Then you've got scoring. Is this going to be a quantitative rubric where you're using it to calculate the marks for the task for you, or no score, which is going to be our qualitative rubric scenario that we have. And then you'll need to define each of the criterion, the headings, and the information that's provided within each of the actual criterion scale cells. And you'll need to populate the columns. That's if you're creating it from scratch. I know that they are working on a feature that will allow you to get your rubric files, for example, out of Excel and elsewhere and upload them into the system. It's not ready yet, however. So in the first instance, you'll need to create those rubrics in here. But once you've created your criterion and your headings and decided whether it was going to be either a qualitative rubric with no score or a custom points rubric, which is what we would use to calculate a quantitative rubric, where you define each of the marks applicable and the total score for each of the criterion, you'll note that there are some options down the bottom. There's 3 in there by default when you create a new rubric, but you can add as many as you like. you'll see the task total that it's calculating for the rubric down the bottom here. If that happens to be out of 100, for example, it will then convert that automatically into the weighting for the assessment task when you set that up. So a lot of people ask about that conversion process. As long as your rubric has the marks that you want to calculate the score out of in the first instance, it will then convert that or apply that to the grade, so to speak, when we set up how much the task is worth. And the range question, Sharon, it's visible to you as long as you use the custom points option. It's visible to you when you go through the marking process. You can click on the actual score and see the full range of other values for you to choose between within each of the scores in here. We looked at that yesterday as well. I'll come show you afterwards as well. All right, down the bottom, there's a section called overall score. Ignore it. That's the simplest way that I can say that. Ignore it. It's misleading. Doesn't really help us in this case because our score is calculated by each of our individual criterion. So don't put anything into this overall score section. Hopefully we'll get that deleted so that it's not even visible. And then there are some options down the bottom. Rubric visibility. For example, do you want it to be visible to students, hidden to students, or, for example, hidden from them until you publish the feedback? And that seems to be quite popular as an option at the moment because arguably they should be looking at the rubric in the subject outline rather than as part of the actual submission process within the tool. Do you want them to see the scores on the rubric, for example? It'll be converted and they'll see the grade ultimately. So you may want to hide the scores as well. And the description isn't visible to students. So unless you particularly want to have a description for your rubric, you'd be leaving that blank. Right down the bottom, there's a couple of options about availability for other tools. We do not use these tools in Brightspace, so that's irrelevant. You can ignore that part as well. So you create the rubric and then you would hit attach and it would be available right here. I think we're, do I need to click hide scores to release the grades? Yeah, Ingrid, they don't have anything to do with one another. The hiding them just means that the students, when they get the rubric, would be able to see those individual score values on the rubric. So it's only really talking about the rubric scores rather than the visibility of their grade being published to the gradebook. So yeah, they're two different things. All right, there's a learning objectives section that's in here. You can leave that out. We're not using the Brightspace tool, learning objectives tool at this point in time. So move on from that. Make sure your annotation tools are ticked. That's part of how we mark within Brightspace. Unless you're doing anonymized marking for some reason, this is going to be unchecked. So we see who the students are. And then we have a Turnitin setup process to work through. And this needs to be done for each assessment. Once we click on it, do we want to turn on the similarity report for Brightspace? Yes, we do. Give that a moment while it creates the class and then the assessment item within Turnitin. Now, do we want the students to be able to see the scores? Yes, we do. We want to check all of the submissions against Turnitin. Then we've got a more options area. Some of this is going to look very familiar to you if you've been working with Turnitin at all, unless, of course, like me, you click it off on the wrong screen right there. Okay, so the submissions are saved to the global repository. Some of these will be grayed out because Brightspace takes carriage of that. So file types, submissions being after due date, etc., Brightspace takes care of that. So that's why they're grayed out. Then we get into our similarity report options. You'll notice that what's there by default is that it will generate the report immediately, but it won't allow students to resubmit. That's not how our drafting process works. So we need to hit the drop down and make sure that you've chosen the second option, which is that students can submit until the due date, resubmit until the due date, and after 3 submissions, that's when Turnitin takes a bit longer to generate the report. So choose that second option. Then you've got some decisions to make out of what's being included or excluded from your similarities. This is discretionary. That's on you, deciding whether or not you want to include or exclude citations or reference lists or use the small sources feature. You can check those or uncheck those. It's up to you. And then the last options by default are all fine, where it's being saved to and what it's checking against. If you're using a template, for example, to exclude the template from the similarity check, the process remains the same. You'll need to upload that Turnitin template in here so that it actually removes the check against that. Usually cover pages and other report types are what you need to include in them. Don't bother checking these, save these settings for future use. It doesn't work. It's meant to, I'm sure, but it doesn't work. You'll need to actually go through that setup process each time in terms of these settings for Turnitin. Hit submit. Then we can save this, and you'll notice that it says now that the similarity report is turned on. All right, so I've gone through the steps there of creating very quickly an assignment. Do use the quick guide that we've provided there, or that we're going to mail around to work through the assignment creation process. But once we create that shell, that's what we've done here, create an assessment shell, an assignment shell, it will be down the bottom of our list, more than likely. I didn't create a category, so it's under no category, but at the bottom, there it is there. It's hidden currently, and I've got another icon there now showing me that Turnitin has been created for this assignment. So that's kind of our visual check to make sure that that's in place. All right, so I've given you the lightning tour of creating an assignment shell, noting also that time is getting away from us there. I would also like to give some mention to quizzes and that process, and what that's going to involve for those of you dealing with a migrated subject site. You're going to find that all of your quiz pools have been migrated across from the Interact 2 site that they've migrated. So if I was to choose any of these, I'll go into one here, this will do. If I was to click on assessment and then quizzes and exams, you can also find quizzes through course admin. If you had quiz instances, which in Blackboard basically was the instruction for how the quiz should be delivered, they will have been copied across. But I don't think personally that they're that useful for you when you're creating. I would be creating a new quiz to set up the way that you want. What is valuable to us is the question library. All of the questions that you had sitting in your pools within I2 will have been migrated across. You'll see each of those folders sitting within here, and you'll be able to draw on those when you're creating your quiz. One small point of clarification, a little bit more technical, maybe for some of the DLT staff in here, is that even though these use the word question pool, they're not question pools. Brightspace, when they import them, actually creates them as a section. I don't know why, it's very strange, but if you edit this, you'll see that it's editing it as a section, which by and large doesn't matter if you just want to go through and have a look at all the questions, for example, and access them. It does matter if you're trying to set up a quiz pool in Brightspace that has certain quiz pool behaviors. So what I'm getting at here, before I go too far off track, is things like the ability to choose a random selection of 10 questions from a pool of 20 relies on the fact that you're using a question pool. So that means that we've got to go through the process of creating actual question pools at that point. So if I haven't confused you then, what that's going to involve, for example, is creating a new question pool. If I go back from editing individual questions, and I'd probably start by creating a new quiz as my first port of call. Just as we were doing within the assignment tool, you need to make sure that the quiz title is as concise but as accurate as possible in terms of the assessment number and the intended cohort. It's the same thing that we were going through with the assignments before. We need to make sure that it can be linked easily when we get to our linking stage. So if this was going to be the third assessment and it was going to be I'll just put in the word quiz at this point. And again, the intended cohort, this is simply so that when we get to that linking aspect, it's easy enough to do. Don't put in the grade. That will be calculated automatically based on the questions that we start adding. And similarly, the due date, we don't put in here as well. Whatever instructions for the task you want to provide will go into the description. You'll see a smaller version of the WYSIWYG here. And then we can start adding in our questions. There is a preview feature built into this, so you can have a look at how the quiz looks at this point in time as you continue to add questions along the way. But if you were going to create a new question pool, this is where you could start that process from. And you would be choosing the questions from within that big list at the back end to go into the question pool from here. So you can either add new questions, add existing questions from the question library. But I think what you're probably going to be doing at this point is creating a new question pool and then adding the questions from your question library that you want to go into the pool. That would be my workflow. But basically, as a part of doing this, you're going to be looking to make sure the questions are the right ones and that the pools are the right ones as well. There's a bit of time involved in scrutinizing your quiz pools is all I can say. We also have some configuration options in here. We looked at availability dates and conditions beforehand. Again, we're not specifying those in here.
Did you catch that question there? Sorry,
go ahead.
Can we use the same quiz for multiple cohorts if they're all doing the same one? I don't remember.
So the answer is, like assignments, you need to make sure that there are duplicate quiz items for each cohort. We need one assessment type for each cohort for each task. So
you can't use the task and then
you can't use
the
same quiz. You need to create the separate quiz instance for each of the cohorts. They can be duplicated, however, in the same way that we saw with assignments and with rubrics. Yeah,
that's him.
What we do have in terms of setup, there's a unique tab for quizzes called timing and display. These options are going to be familiar to you. They're the same sorts of things we set up in I2 with our quizzes. Is there a time limit? How do we want the questions to be displayed? Do we want them to be shuffled, for example? Hints is a new one for me. I don't remember seeing that somewhere, but I probably am not providing hints for questions. Then we also have some attempts and completion settings. How many attempts do we want them to get with the quizzes? And then evaluation and feedback. There's a setting in here that you probably do want to look at called auto publish. Now, I'm not getting into publishing of grades and how that works today, obviously. That's in the engage assess session. But the auto publish setting means that as soon as they do the quiz and finish it, they're going to get the results immediately. That could be quite problematic, as we probably want to release or publish at a certain date. At the moment, what you're going to need to do is uncheck that box on auto publish. Yeah, that's not the same as grading it automatically, but it is going to release their attempt results straight away if that box is checked. Okay, when we're published, what do we want them to be able to see? For example, the right questions, the wrong questions, the ones they answered, all of the options. These are the same options that we had in our quizzes in I2.
Do the rubrics go across with the duplicate of the assessment?
There isn't a rubric tool with the quiz.
So, will the rubric be carried across when doing a duplicate of the assessment for each cohort?
Now I'm with you. Sorry. The answer is yes, it will be sitting there. I generally encourage you to have a different rubric for each of the cohorts, but you can use the same rubric. It only gets tricky when it's starting to be in use. So as soon as you've marked some assignments and with a particular rubric attached to it, you can't change that rubric at all whilst it's being used. So that means it's got to be duplicated and renamed as something else anyway. So it's for you to make changes to a rubric. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but basically during the marking process, once you've started applying grades and using a rubric, it's locked. It can't be modified, which means you're going to have to change it at some point anyway. So I'm not sure if I've confused you on that answer, but I'm happy to talk about it offline. All right, so look, time has obviously gotten away from me, so I will see just how far out of whack I am against the deck for today. We talked a little bit about assignment shells. I've given you a quick guide for those. We talked a little bit about rubrics. You've got a quick guide for those as well. By and large, the process of dealing with a master site means that you've got to have proofed the content so that it's ready to be distributed in the session site, and created the assessment shells, one for each cohort for each assessment task for when it's going to be rolling out in the next teaching session. Those are your main tasks. When it comes to quizzes, that means obviously creating the quiz pools and pulling from the question pools which have been pulled across. So there's some work there to be done in terms of checking it and preparing them, and configuring your assignments as such. One thing we haven't touched on today is the discussion forums tool and creating accessible discussions. I do talk about that some more in the Engage Communicate session, but I'm also hoping to have a quick guide available for you on that as well in the not too distant future. If you'd like to talk to me about any of these aspects as well that have been a bit that we've flown through very briefly today, I'm happy to hang around for a bit as well to chat to you about it. But otherwise, I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment. The last slide that is in the deck that's given to you today also talks a little bit about the Engage sessions that are also being run, and the distinction that we make in those between using the session subject site and our business as usual, our delivery within the teaching site, versus the preparation work that we've been talking about today in the master site. So I hope I haven't confused you too much, but there's a lot of exploration and self-discovery as well to be happening within Brightspace, and we're happy to field any of your questions, etc., and hope to see you in some of the other sessions that we run. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll stop the recording there.